This is Gregory Shelton with Historic Living, Modern World. It's very warm outside. 4th of July is right around the corner. There's nothing more American than a sweet apple pie. Today I'm going to show you a family recipe that is absolutely to die for. It's not hard to make, and I'm going to show you how to do it. So when we're talking about an American apple pie, I'm using my mother's recipe. And what I remember from that was really spicy, the crust was unbelievable, and we lived on these things all summer. It's not hard to make, but there's a couple details that I'm gonna go into that's gonna make for an amazing apple pie. The type of apples you use to make an apple pie is incredibly important. Now these are Granny Smith, which I think are great apples for apple pie. My mother used them. But you can use a Winesap apple, you can use a Braeburn, or you can use maybe a Honeycrisp. But the consistency is incredibly important. Not only is the sourness of the apple, it's going to be really great, but you want something that's going to remain firm. When you cut into an apple pie, you don't want to use a damn knife. You want your fork to be able to go through, but you do not want applesauce. We do not want high moisture. We want a solid content. Granny Smith for this pie is going to be perfect. The other main thing that makes this a differentiating pie is the spices that we're going to be using. Because a standard American apple pie is a buttered crust, which is easy and really amazing, but the spices make the difference. My mother always loaded the spices. So what we have here is some cinnamon, we have nutmeg, we have a little bit of clove, and we have an amazing spice called cardamom. These are cardamom pods. They come from South India. I have a very close Indian friend who always would make me Indian tea, and he would always take the pods and crush them to make the fresh spice for the tea. And it's unbelievable. And these pods really make the difference. So we're gonna hand grind them. We're gonna add it to the spices that we've already measured and make a very sexy, spicy pie that will make the difference for your party. So when you're making something here where you're putting a lot of work into it, you're only as good as the tools that you use to make it. So I want to highlight a couple things that I think make the difference in making an efficient pie. Standard peeler. I always have my trusty Japanese knife when you're cutting your apples. A pastry knife when you're making your crust. I'm looking at using a Mellon baller, which actually will get the core of the apple, because I hate like hell to waste any of that fruit. I'm using a pizza cutter when I roll the dough to make the lattice top for our pie. And lastly, we have a mortar and pestle because I'm gonna freshly grind the cardamom pods. So we're gonna be using about a 1/4 teaspoon, and I wanna make sure it's freshly done. Okay, so we talk about this recipe. You're really gonna use 7 to 8 apples, and the first thing you need to do is peel them because you do not want the skin. So you're doing a standard peel here. And boy, this brings back major memories because I remember as a little kid, my twin brother and I would always sit at the foot of the table where my mom was peeling apples and making crusts. And I will never forget, we used to eat raw pie dough, as crazy as it sounds. The reason being is my mom would always load up on salt and spices in the filling. And sometimes we would get full just eating undercooked stuff, which might not be the most healthiest thing, but I can tell you, man, it was the great prelude to a wonderful dessert, and we loved it. Always remember when you're peeling your apples, you're gonna be left with a lot of apple peels. That needs to be in your garden. So if you're gonna be doing a compost pile, it's perfect stuff to add to it. When you're making this recipe, you know, it's really made for a 9-inch pie plate, which is a larger pie plate than obviously an 8, which some people use. So it's really an old-fashioned country-style pie. You want to pile the apples up, but if you have a little extra, you know, apples historically, because sugar was so expensive, back in the 1600s, they didn't use crust around them. They would create a filling and you would eat the filling with different spices. But in the 1600s in America is really when the first pie started to show up with a crust around it. So that's how long we've been eating this thing, even though we know the Dutch brought it to America and created the first apple pie. Although it's been eaten all over the world probably for thousands of years. Okay, so there's really 2 ways to peel an apple to cut it to get it for your filling. I'm gonna show you exactly what they mean. So you're gonna use a very, very sharp knife as one experience to get the core out. Now these are smaller apples, so you can take a little melon baller and kind of get 2 little turns and it can get the core out. And that's a very efficient way of doing it. The only thing about it is you don't want to lose any of that apple. So although you are getting it out in a very uniform way, you take the top out, and that really gives you a beautifully uniform apple for cutting your slices for your pie. Now the other option would be to take a paring knife. This is what my mom would do. She would hand cut the pieces around the core, which again, my mom just did this because she would make probably 4 or 5 pies at a time. The only thing about that is you tend to get the fibrous stuff that's around the core, and it doesn't really taste good. So the melon baller actually is a wonderfully modern way of getting the core out in a very efficient manner. All right, it's time to make the filling, one of the most important parts of a wonderful apple pie. So I've cut my apples, kind of thin slices, put in your mixing bowl here. First ingredients, 1/2 cup of brown sugar. You can use dark brown sugar, or I'm using light, and then 1/2 cup of standard white granulated sugar to the mix. We're gonna add 1/4 teaspoon. I'm using kosher salt, which I just love to cook with kosher salt, it has more flavor. And since this is a liquid, that will break down when we're stirring. We're also going to be needing a thickening agent here. So what we're going to be using is standard cornstarch. This is 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, and that is going to be, of course, the thickening agent that makes this a great, almost like a sauce in the apple pie for the filling. Isn't that beautiful? All right, we talked a little bit about the spices being so important for this apple pie. We have our cinnamon, we have our little bit of cloves, and we have our nutmeg. Basic, almost fall spices, but the cardamom is the thing that we really want to keep an eye on. Now, I could have bought powdered cardamom, but to me, I think it's really about buying it fresh from the pod, and I want to show you exactly what is inside them. So when you open up a pod, you can crack them open, and then what's in them are these little pods here. They're kind of thick and they're very coarse. They're basically little berries. So you want to put them in your mortar and pestle. And you need about 1/4 teaspoon here, so you're going to need a lot. But you break them open, you take the contents out. And these will break down pretty quickly if you're using a matching mortar and pestle. A lot of times what people do the mistake of is they try to take a pestle from a separate mortar, and it doesn't match the concave or the convex experience of this. And that really can be a problem with if you want to get a uniform crush to your spices. Boy, I tell you, when you look at what's inside of these kinds of things, pepper's the same way, as are herbs and spices. Really what makes the fragrance so powerful when you crush them or when you expose them to air is really the oils that are getting out. You're really smelling the oils of the cardamom, and that's what makes it permeate the air, which again, is really what is important to making this a real wonderfully smelling pie. Okay, so we're gonna crush this up. Oh my gosh, you can smell it, it's really unbelievable. You can hear the berries getting crushed. You don't have to go a powder. You can leave this kind of a coarse, almost like a black pepper. That's fine. But I do want to show you what it's going to look like. So when you look at what you have left over in the mortar and pestle, you have a fine spice that's really going to be beautiful in your apple pie. Okay, so we're going to be adding our spices to our apple filling. Not a big deal here, but this is really, what I'm going to be doing here is I'm really looking at this as a test. I have a measurement that I think works, but to be honest, you really want to, if I want this to be like Mom's apple pie, it's the smell and the look of the filling. Now, we talk about the idea of it being a beautiful smell, which is easy because it's just such amazing fragrance. All right, some of the most important parts of any pastry is the crust. All pies have to have it. It formulates all the filling. Without a good crust, your pie is not gonna be worth a darn. So I wanna show you how to make a very simple crust that's gonna be nice and light. It's gonna be flaky. It's gonna have a little bit of salt and sweet built into it. It's gonna be perfect. So you wanna start off with your flour. You wanna do about 1.5 cups of flour, general standard flour. To your flour, you wanna add a teaspoon of salt. And then you wanna add a tablespoon of standard white granulated sugar. Now that's really meant to give you a little bit of a sweetness to the crust, but not too much. And then what you really wanna do is you wanna have a glass or a cup of water. We're using filtered water with some ice cubes because it needs to be ice cold. Okay, so you want to use 2 sticks of unsalted butter. Now these have been chilling since we decided we're going to be making a pie today. And what you really want to do is you want to take them out of the wrapper as best as you can. And what you want to do is you want to cut them into small pieces. Now, a lot of people always want to know why unsalted butter. The reason is because a lot of times when you're making stuff homemade like this, you don't want to trust the person that made the butter when it comes from a big company of how much salt. You want to know how much salt is going into your pie. So we let our pie crust or our dough chill for about an hour. So we have it wrapped in saran wrap. You can tell it's chilled, it's very cold. I pulled it out a little bit, about 5 minutes extra to let it sit a little bit. Now it's ready to roll out. So we have our surface. We're gonna lightly dust it with flour so the crust doesn't stick. You don't wanna go with too much flour, keep in mind, but you wanna have enough just so it does not stick. So we have our filling in, it looks beautiful, it smells amazing. The crust is already in the pan. All we need to do is get the rest of the beautiful juice that's from the natural apples and the thickening agent. We're just gonna put that over top. And while this cooks and thickens, it will bubble everywhere, and that's gonna really immerse the apples in the spices, and it's really gonna make for a beautiful filling. Okay. Now it's time to roll out our lattice works for the top of our apple pie. So we're gonna make a quick egg wash, and this is really gonna make this thing pop. So our American apple pie is done. It's cooled on a cooling rack. It's ready to eat, but man, this thing looks really unbelievable. Look at that lattice work. What I love about the pie, just looking at it, now of course it still smells like cardamom, the cinnamon's unreal, but I love the fact that there's some juice everywhere. It's almost a very syrupy experience. The lattice work looks great. The egg yolk wash made a beautiful golden brown. I cannot wait to give this a taste. So we got a slice out on the plate. Looks great, but I tell you, it doesn't matter how good it looks if it doesn't taste great. So we have to give this thing a try. Oh man. Oh boy. My mother would be proud. Oh, the apples were a perfect choice. It's really spicy, but a little hint of sugar. It's not overly sweet. The apples are cooked just enough to be dangerous, and the pie crust is light and flaky. And this pie will absolutely make your 4th of July picnic a showstopper. If you like what you've seen today, make sure you click like and subscribe, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. This is Gregory Shelton with Historic Living Modern World, reminding you, whenever you do something, work to move people. Cheers.